Having lived as a German in the United States on and off for 46 years, I can't help seeing our two countries as an odd couple of lovers. Sometimes we give each other the best. Many of your universities have been crafted after German universities. A German general taught your Continental Army Prussian drill and discipline. But by God, we've also exchanged nasty infections in our relationship. 1 century after Nietzsche declared God dead, the most stirring topic at Princeton Seminary was, what will we preach Easter morning? Sometimes one feels that a warped zeitgeist blows across the Atlantic from east to west, where it is vulgarized, repackaged, and shipped back, only to be resystematized and returned west in an even nastier form. I'm a journalist, and this is my journalistic take. Listen to a much more scholarly presentation by Dr. Irving Hexham, Professor of Religious Studies of the University of Calgary, and Dr. Purvis' husband. Irving.
While this is being changed and put right so that I can show you my slides, I must correct a terrible slander of Dr. Simonetto about our gracious Queen Victoria. She was not a forerunner of political correctness. That was her husband, Albert of Saxe-Coburg. We seem to be right now, so thank you. What I'm going to do is base my talk on my PowerPoint presentation, and I want to look back and try and trace some of the roots of this new religion. And the person I'm going back to, Ludwig Feuerbach, whom you may or may not know about as German thinker in the 19th century, who's normally regarded as a left-wing Hegelian. This is the way he's described. Okay, this left one. Okay, so what I'm wanting to talk about is ancestral neo-Paganism. Feuerbach was born in Ansbach in Bavaria, and born in Landshut and educated in Ansbach at the gymnasium. And a few years ago, about 3 years ago, the Rotary Club of all things unveiled a plaque in his memory. So he's still alive today in at least German culture. He was educated to begin with at the University of Heidelberg, which Americans know, I think, through the student prince. And there he studied classics before moving on to the Humboldt University in Berlin, which then was the University of Berlin. Today it's the Humboldt University. And there he went to study with Hegel and Schleiermacher. So this is his background. He's interested in theology and theological issues, but already in the gymnasium and then at Heidelberg, he had doubts about Orthodox Christianity. And he develops very slowly his own critique of Christianity. He completed his doctorate at the University of Erlangen and produced in due course a radical critique of Christianity, the book The Essence of Christianity. I'll stick to the English titles in this talk. As a result of The Essence of Christianity and his criticisms of Christianity, he was unable to get the desired university position, which he hoped to get. He thought he would become a professor, but no one would appoint him. He blamed the church for this. They didn't allow him to become a professor, and he ended up working for the Social Democratic Workers' Party, which was the forerunner of the SPD. So Feuerbach, interestingly enough, and this is something which isn't generally recognized, was influenced by the English-American Tom Paine. If you know your American history, Tom Paine is the man who wrote a book, a short book called Common Sense, and in Common Sense, he advocated the separation of the American colonies from Britain. So he was the first person to say that America ought to separate from Britain. He also became the key publicist of the American Revolution. And after the Revolution, he went on to write his book, The Age of Reason, which is a critique of Christianity, a very devastating critique of Christianity. Now, Feuerbach makes no mention of Tom Paine in any of his published writings. I assume this is because Paine's writings were banned by the censors in Prussia. They had been published almost immediately, or translated almost immediately into German in Philadelphia, and they were published in both Leipzig and Hamburg. But Feuerbach, living under Prussian rule, makes no mention of them. However, in his private correspondence, he talks about the famous famous American philosopher, Tom Paine, which shows he knows them. And when one reads Feuerbach, many of the passages in The Essence of Christianity in particular sound almost identical to Paine. It's almost as though at times he plagiarizes, which he doesn't. I mean, I'm not suggesting this for 1 minute because of the issue of censorship. You find the same thing with Karl Marx. Marx makes no mention of Tom Paine while he lives in continental Europe. It's only when he gets to the relatively liberal atmosphere of England and the British Museum that suddenly Tom Paine appears in his writings. As long as he's in Europe, there's no mention of Paine. And so what I suggest is that the main thing Feuerbach picks up from Paine is the idea that Christianity is a form of atheism. In The Age of Reason, Tom Paine says, "As to the Christian system of faith, it appears to me a species of atheism. It professes to believe in a man rather than in God. It is a compound made up chiefly of manism, but with little deism, and is as near to atheism as twilight is to light." And this is the basic argument that Feuerbach develops in The Essence of Christianity. Religion, at least the Christian religion, is the relation of man to himself. The divine being is nothing else than the human being. And Feuerbach develops this very systematically through The Essence of Christianity, which, as I said, he is regarded for this as being on the left of the Hegelian group in German intellectual history. Feuerbach always maintained that he wasn't really an atheist himself, because the atheist is someone for whom the predicates of divine existence are meaningless, whereas Feuerbach argued that the predicates of divine existence, love, mercy, justice, all of these things, the abstract ideas about God, are meaningful, but the subject, God, is not meaningful. So what does this leave us with? Feuerbach argues that essentially religion is the relationship of the human being to the human being's own nature, the relationship of man in a non-politically correct world to man's own nature. And this is what it's about, and this is what we need to celebrate. And he's famous for many of his aphorisms, like, "Only the poor man has a rich God," because Feuerbach says religion is essentially a form of psychological projection, that we have longings and ideas, and we project these things that are missing from our life onto God, and we create God in our own image. So for him, monasticism is a supreme example. If you look at the medieval writers, the monastic writers, when they write about God, he says that they've got this wonderfully rich and powerful, transcendent God. And the poorer they are, the more they practice worldly deprivation, the more they starve themselves and go on fasts, the more they do this sort of thing, the greater their vision of God. And this is an example of how projection occurs. Religion, at least the Christian, is an abstraction from the world. It is essentially inward. The religious man leads a life of withdrawal from the world. The more empty life is, the fuller, the more concrete God. The impoverishing of the real world and the enriching of God is one act. Only the poor man has a rich God. And this is the basis of what becomes known later as the deprivation theory of religion, which Sigmund Freud, who acknowledged the influence of Feuerbach, developed in his writings on religion, and which have become fairly standard in a lot of sociological accounts of religion. So religion arises out of our own deprivation. We don't recognize it. It's a false consciousness that is projected onto God. We create a God. And so my little diagram here is that you have all of these different families, some with kids, lots of kids, some with not many kids. And in all of these families, there are things that are missing. There are failures. And from them, we all, looking at other families, looking at people around us, because we live in community, and we have a sociology of knowledge that creates an idea of reason, kindness, fairness, love, justice, mercy. Any of the attributes of God come from a partial vision of human experience. And then we project them into this other realm, this otherworldly realm, and we say, God is these. God is transcendent. God is all-knowing. God is omnipotent. We say these things of God, and yet these things don't really exist. These are our longings for what should be. And the Holy Family, Feuerbach says, is simply a projection of the human family. The idea of a perfect family, the Holy Family, is brought about by the inadequacies of our own families, that we see these inadequacies. Further, normally in good health, human beings have no wish to die. But nevertheless, death is inevitable. And so Feuerbach says, this creates ideas of immortality and also of heaven. But the idea of heaven is a contradiction, because heaven is playing your harp and doing nothing, and it's outside of time. And human beings are continually striving for life. Therefore, heaven is itself an impossibility. Similarly, the resurrection itself, the resurrection of Christ, and again he picks this up very much from Tom Paine's argument about the resurrection, involves a wish fulfillment, because the idea of the resurrection provides human beings with the certainty that they too can be resurrected. No one wants to die, but we're all going to die. But if someone is actually raised from the dead, then we can believe that there is a life after death. And Feuerbach says this is just pure wish fulfillment on our part. Immortality is a fantastic desire, and it's fulfilled not within the real world, but immortality actually comes, Feuerbach says, within the human race. The race is, for all intents and purposes, immortal. The human, the individual human, dies. Faith in the future life is therefore only faith in the true life of the present. And the true life of the present is the ongoing life of the community. Now you see where he's beginning to go. Feuerbach himself was not a racist. He was not a nationalist in any meaningful sense, certainly not in the 20th century sense, but nevertheless, he lays a foundation where these things quickly become very real. Because Feuerbach says that it is only natural that men should worship not nature in general, but the nature of this country. For it is to this country that I alone owe my life and what I am. I myself am not a man as such, but this particular individual man. I, for example, am a man who speaks and thinks in German. My life is inseparably bound up with a specific soil, a specific climate. So he moves actually into laying the foundation for a form of nationalist thinking which becomes very important in the type of religious movement Carla was talking about a few minutes ago. Another thinker who's very strongly influenced by Feuerbach, who admits his influence by Feuerbach, is the great biblical critic David Friedrich Strauss, whose the life of Jesus critically examined, caused an earthquake throughout the theological world in the early part of the 19th century. Strauss himself began, again, rather like Feuerbach, studying theology. There's some strange things appear to go on when he's a theological student in Tübingen. He seems to go along to some spiritualists and things like this. There's certainly some spiritualist involvement in his early history. And then he loses his faith. He writes a devastating critique of Christianity. He tries, or of the Bible, he tries to remain a Christian for a while. Eventually he becomes involved in what at that time was fairly liberal politics. This again is one of the interesting things, rather like Feuerbach. Eventually he ends up with his last publication, The Old Faith and the New. And in The Old Faith and the New, he says quite simply, we can no longer believe in Christianity. We've got to get rid of that illusion. We can't even adapt Christianity to our needs, as he had thought earlier. We need a new faith. And the only thing he's got to offer for the basis of his new faith is German poets, German culture, German literature, German art. These are the things that make up a sense of worth. It's a very weak book in a sense at the very end, but again, it's this nationalist element comes out of it. So what I want to suggest is that there is this link between Tom Paine and Feuerbach and Strauss, where they are looking towards a new type of religion. And this religion in the 19th century is then very rapidly spread. These ideas are very rapidly spread. Both Feuerbach and Strauss had the good fortune of a great translator, George Eliot, the British novelist. And Eliot, in her novels, also brings out these themes. If any of you have read Middlemarch, the discussion in Middlemarch is very much around Feuerbachian themes. The idea of loss of faith is a key element throughout Middlemarch. And in Daniel Deronda, one of her later novels, Eliot takes as a hero a young man who doesn't realize he's Jewish, and then discovers he's Jewish, and becomes a forerunner of the Zionists, because he finds his future, he finds his religious roots in his people. A very nationalist sort of theme that comes out of Eliot's later work, but very much rooted in Feuerbach. A similar sort of thing, Samuel Butler's book, The Way of All Flesh. It also deals very directly with Feuerbach's ideas, and consciously with them. Butler translated a lot of German philosophy into English, the German atheistic philosophy. Surprisingly, also, one gets the influence of Feuerbach in Karl May. Now, if any of you are wondering where I get this from, I get it from the Karl May yearbook, where it said he was very profoundly influenced by Feuerbach. Hans Grimm, very clearly, I have no direct sources for saying he's influenced by Feuerbach, but nevertheless, if you read particularly his South African novels, the idea that the only future life is in your people, in your survival in these extreme conditions, is very, very Feuerbachian, as is the efforts to remember Hans Grimm himself. If you visit his shrine in, I forget where it is, but anyway, it is there. One finds this also through one of the great influences on the Nazis, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was the son-in-law of Richard Wagner, who was an Englishman, who became a German, and who again took up a lot of these ideas, but particularly the ideas of Feuerbach, and wrote his most famous book, The Foundations of the 19th Century. The Foundations of the 19th Century today is regarded as garbage. Nobody would admit to reading it or thinking there was anything of any value in it. And yet, when it came out, the Times of London, the New York Times, all sorts of newspapers, when the English translation came out in 1911, praised it as a brilliant work. This is one of the ironies of history. We don't like what Chamberlain said today because he's talking about racial history. But around the turn of the 20th century, he was regarded as a great thinker by people on both sides of the Atlantic, and both in the English and in the German-speaking world. Chamberlain also played around with what he called the Aryan worldview, with race and nation and various other religious themes that fed very much into the new religions of the Nazi period. And the person who who incorporated Chamberlain's ideas most clearly was Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg, in his Mythos particularly, was very strongly influenced by Chamberlain. He admits this, he says it. There are also many passages in the Mythos that are very similar to Feuerbach. There's a clear Feuerbachian influence in this. I'm running out of time, so I'll go on rather quickly. There's a tendency today to say that the myth of the 20th century, which was Rosenberg's major work, was not very influential in the Nazi era. This is in fact rubbish. There's lots of evidence. It was a runaway bestseller, and there were all sorts of study circles, particularly among students, studying his work. To put it in context, though, if you try and read it, it is a really weird book. But one's got to remember there are lots of weird books. You know, Mark Twain said the Book of Mormon is chloroform in print. But, you know, people still read it and base their lives on it. And Rosenberg's book, I think, has to be seen in this light. Studies in the Scripture that the Jehovah's Witnesses have based their ideas on, very similar. Because a book appears to be garbage to us now, and because it's obtuse and it doesn't seem to make sense to an academic, doesn't mean it isn't very popular with the public. One's got to always remember this. And Howard picks up, who Carlos talked about, these ideas in his Indo-Germanic thing and his movement, particularly the person who really, I haven't time to go into it too much, but the person who really picks up on Feuerbach's ideas is Matilda Ludendorff. Her ideas about death and how one faces death and immortality are straight out of Feuerbach, and they're this idea that one must recognize that death is the end of the individual. Death is the end. There is no future other than in our descendants. And our descendants give us immortality when they remember us. This is basically the idea of Ludendorff's religion. Now, I want to, that's Ludendorff's grave, by the way, which Ludendorff, in case some of you might not know, I assume you all do, was the supreme commander of the German army in the First World War. And his grave is a pagan grave, a deliberately pagan grave. The New Right in Germany, some branches of the New Right at least, combine these religious ideas with a political agenda, a metapolitics based upon the work of the Italian Marxist Gramsci. They want a cultural change, and Sigrid Hunke, who Carlos talked about, is one of these people. Common to all of this is the idea that Christianity is a bad thing and we've got to get rid of Christianity. So there's a consistent assault upon the Judeo-Christian tradition. As this recent book, published in 2005, Europe's False God, speaks for itself. One finds this in our own society. In Canada, you have a very popular writer, Tom Harper, who's published a book, The Pagan Christ. Scholars generally think it's garbage, but it was financed by the Canada Council, and it is a bestseller. And again, he links into the type of idea that Chamberlain comes up with, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Makes no direct reference to him, but refers to authors that Chamberlain refers to. Similarly, I think one finds it in Bishop Spong. There is, I think, an American paganism here. When one reads Spong's books, we find that his view of theism and of immortality are exactly Feuerbach. Theism as a way of defining God is dead, so most theological talk, God talk, is today meaningless. A new way to speak of God must be found. Since God can no longer be conceived in theistic terms, it becomes nonsense to seek to understand Jesus as the incarnation of a theistic deity. So the Christology of the ages is bankrupt. This is an Anglican bishop. But then along comes his statement on eternal life. Eternal life is not just a pious dream, it is also attached to my understanding of God as the ground of all being. It is a mystical experience of escaping boundaries. this place where finitude fades into infinity, a sense of eternity. The God whom I meet in my depths becomes the God of the infinite. To the degree that I know this God, I know the meaning of life. I don't know what he's talking about, frankly. It's gobbledygook. But when he talks about immortality, what is immortality? Straight Feuerbach. We live through our children, our friends, our associates. I carry within myself not only the heritage of the gene pool that created me, but also the cultural and emotional history that shaped me. There is also some level of immortality in those whose lives each of us has shaped and in relationships. Feuerbach could have written this, Matilda Ludendorff could have written this. But this is now promoted in the Anglican Church as the wave of the future. I think you find, again, even a scholar like Bart Ehrman, if you read his books, they're very much along the themes of these writers like Klages and Rosenberg. Many of his ideas, the things he comes out with, echo the same longing for finding a tradition of heretics. This was the great thing of the folkish movement. Link yourself with the heretics of the past. This is what these people are doing in North America. You also have, I think, a degree of academic adventurism, as I would call it, Richard Steigman Gall being probably the major exponent of it, and his book, in case you don't know it, The Holy Reich, where he attempts to argue that everyone has misunderstood the Nazis because the Nazis were actually Christians acting out a Christian agenda. They weren't church Christians, he says. They didn't like the church, but that's confused everybody. But really they were Christian nevertheless. Personally, I think it's rubbish, and I've written a paper to say that. One finds in all of these things an attack upon two issues, the Bible and the church. All of these writers combine, as Strauss and Feuerbach did, to undermine the Bible of the church. And today, this is organized in a movement. I don't know if you've come across them, but Richard Dawkins and others have a thoroughgoing anti-religious movement linked around the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Very interesting website. Steigman Gall is tied in with them very loosely. And these people really want to free us from the influence of religion. It's working to promote free thought. They've got a wonderful website, and they're wanting to challenge the role of the church in society. And in doing so, they want to save us from they want to present the good, which is themselves, the bad, which was Jerry Falwell. They've not updated this, poor Jerry, and the ugly, which some of you may like or may not like. Basically, there are a number of philosophers, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins himself, and all of it is presenting an aggressive atheism. I don't know, there should be a slide of my favorite, and that's Christopher Hitchens. Maybe the slides have got out of order. But basically, with Christopher Hitchens there at the front, this is Hitchens, who's written this book, God is Not Great, to which I take my hat off to him. At least he has the courage to condemn Islam and say nasty things about them as well as Christianity. The English philosopher Anthony Grayling is also among these people. He's written a very good book about the bombing of Germany in the Second World War and the moral implications of that, but nevertheless he is part of this anti-Christian movement. As Sam Harris, The End of Faith. He is Hitchens. I don't know how those slides sometimes get out of place. Hitchens, I think, is great fun, and this is on his own website, which I think is just wonderful. So we have this anti-Christian movement which closely links in with new religious movements, which prepares the way for new religious movements which are uncannily like the folkish movements of the 1920s and 30s. And on that note, I will end. I hope I've kept within my time, but this last slide shows where these people hope to go, but not where I think they're actually going.